And please feel free to ask questions.
Oh, that's working.
What I'm going to do is give you a short history of the building, which will then help, I hope, put into context as we go around and I point various things out to you. Now, any of you know who the Earl of Chester is? Who's the Earl of Chester? Anyone any ideas? Well, the Earl of Chester is actually the Prince of Wales. So Prince William at the moment,
right.
but of course it was the King, Charles, until last September. He was Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester, and often came to Chester. He had quite a strong connection because of his Earl of Chester. Now, it hasn't always been the case that the Earl of Chester was, if you like, the person in line to the throne, the Prince of Wales. That was only the case from about 1340 onwards. Up to 1340, the Earl of Chester was appointed by the king, a knight. And the first Earl of Chester was a man called Hugh d'Avranches, okay? And he became Earl of Chester in 1071. Now, he played a big part in all of this, okay? Before then, 600 AD, there was probably on this site a wooden-built Anglo-Saxon church, where we are now in the nave. By 900, we know there was definitely a stone-built Anglo-Saxon church here, okay? But move on to Hugh d'Avranches, when he became Earl of Chester. He had a nickname, and his nickname was called Lupus. His nickname was Lupus, which means wolf in Latin. And he was wolf by name and wolf by nature. He was a man not to cross. He took no prisoners. He was also quite immoral and lived a pretty degenerate kind of life. But he was ruthless. But like lots of people like that in positions of power,
Henry VIII is one.
position of power. He was like the local protector. He ruled the roost in the area. There was a sort of pious side to him as well. And come 1090 or thereabouts, he started to worry what was going to happen to him when he left this mortal world. In other words, would he be going up to heaven, or would he be going down to somewhere else? And this troubled him greatly. And in the end, he decided to come up with what you might call a cunning plan. And his cunning plan was to try and get into God's good books by building a monastery here. Because he thought if he built a monastery here, then great, he'd be in God's favour. And so what he did was he went to Normandy. He came from Normandy. He was a Norman knight. He went to Normandy, to the Abbey at Bec, and there he recruited a very famous monk called Anselm. Have you ever heard of Anselm? Well, Anselm, who became Saint Anselm, was actually appointed in 1093 Archbishop of Canterbury. And even today, Anselm is considered a very important theologian. He's quite a significant theological figure. And Anselm came here to Chester with about 10 or 12 monks from the Abbey at Bec to create a monastery. Hugh Lupus gave them land, gave them money, so they could build a church, and next door here, the monastery, the domestic buildings of the monastery. Do you all know what a monastery is? What happens at a monastery?
Roughly.
A monastery is where monks live, basically.
Monks, yeah.
Monks. It's not a cathedral. A monastery is where monks live, and there are different orders of monks. So you've got Jesuit monks and Franciscan monks. Now, the order of monks that came here from Normandy were Benedictine monks.
Like Buckfast Abbey. They have monks. I think they're Benedictine monks, yeah.
Now, Benedictine monks, they follow the rules of St. Benedict, They were an order. They were a kind of closed order in the sense that, unlike, say, the Franciscans that went out into the community to care for people, the monks stayed here, and people from the community came to them. But they were very welcoming and very hospitable, and as you can imagine, played a very important role in providing, you know, things for the community, food and medicines, for example, and so on, and care for the sick, and education, and all that. The monastery was a very important. I mean, it's really covered now by what we think of as the public services or the social services. It was all done in those days by the monasteries. And the monks here built, first of all, they built the church and the monastery. And it all started in 1092, so almost 1,000 years ago now. Now what's odd, what's curious about it all, is they built it, and they built it in what's called the Norman or Romanesque style of architecture. Any of you know about architecture and what that is? Well, Romanesque or Norman is big round pillars, recessed doorways, big round arches, heavy but small windows. And the reason they built like this, where they were the first, what you think of as castle builders, the Normans, and they built cathedrals and churches and monasteries like castles, basically. And the monks built their monastery here, a bit like that. But then, 150 years later, fashions in Europe, architecture changed. And what became very fashionable was the Gothic style. And so the monks literally pulled down the Norman and rebuilt it in the Gothic. And what we see today is Gothic. So these high arches, pointed arches, high roof, lots of light, very different from the Norman style. And that's what happened here. Now we move on from that sort of medieval period to 1540. Does anybody know what happened in 1540? Well, 1540 was when Henry VIII, Henry and 6 wives.
Oh, yeah,
he was
Henry.
on the throne, yeah. And one of his wives, Anne Boleyn, he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, but he was already married to Catherine of Aragon. So what did he do? Well, he decided he'd split the church from the Pope. And he formed, in effect, the English Catholic Church, what we think of today as the Church of England. Now, because he split from the Pope, he decided he was going to do away with all the monasteries. To use a technical expression, he dissolved the monasteries. And he literally, in some cases, did. Because if you travel around the country, you'll find lots of ruined monasteries.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
Of
Yeah.
Henry VIII. Fountains Abbey, ruined monastery, pulled down. It's terrible. The sort of damage he did to our culture and heritage from the Middle Ages is nobody's business. And he also insisted that all stained glass and stuff should be destroyed.
We very well know that our country.
So that was terrible, wasn't it? Anyway, Henry VIII. Now, Chester was very fortunate.
The people growing them should
because
be treated as fairly and equally as the
he said to the abbot here, he said, look, I can dissolve you and pull you down, and that'll be the end of you. But I've decided to form a new diocese, and it's called the Chester Diocese. And if you want, I'll make your monastery into Chester Cathedral. And so in 1541, this became a cathedral. Now this is only one of six cathedrals in the country that previously was a monastery. Because all the others were built as cathedrals. So like Durham, Canterbury, they were built as cathedrals. York was built as a cathedral. But this was a monastery. So this has been a monastery, and since 1541, it's been a cathedral. Now, the other big point is that by the Victorian period, this building had really degenerated, it had really deteriorated physically, and it needed a huge amount of restoration. And so they appointed a famous architect, George Gilbert Scott, to come in and put it all right. And so a lot of what we see dates to the Victorian times when George Gilbert Scott did his restoration. So, at the time of the Reformation, Henry VIII, the medieval glass got smashed. They replaced it with plain glass. George Gilbert Scott came in, and we now have beautiful coloured glass. But a lot of it is Victorian. A lot of it is Victorian. This roof is Victorian. This is George Gilbert Scott. Okay? Those ribs, you call them ribs. Do you think they look like stone?
Yes.
They're wood, actually. So it's very clever, isn't it? Yeah, it's very clever. They're wood. That mosaic over there, that's 83, Victorian. Done by a guy on Clayton. What's nice about it is it's made out of clear marble ceramic. So that's why it's got its, I think what I call beauty really. It's you know, the faces are so clear and lifelike. A lady said to me it could do with some TLC, it needed a good clean. In a way she's right, it could do with a bit of TLC, but it was, when it was made and installed, it was intended to fit in with the colour of the stone. So it's not as faded as you imagine. Yeah, it could do with a clean, I'm sure, but it's not as faded as you might think. Yeah, okay. Well, it's a potted history. So monastery, then cathedral, big restoration in the Victorian period. What we're going to do now is I'm going to take you round and go through various bits of the cathedral. We'll start off at the earliest and then we'll work around coming back to the more recent. Okay? Now, has anyone any questions? Anything you'd like?
When it was a monastery and then became the cathedral, did the monks also feel that they could adopt the new church?
Yeah, they
or
did.
what? Oh, they did. So it wasn't a question of giving up the...
No, the abbot, he was a guy called John Clark. He became the first dean. And the monks, they became what's called prebendaries, which these days are called canons. But that's very similar. So the monks, oh yes, they were all assimilated into the cathedral.
I thought...
So they weren't homeless. No, they weren't
They were
thrown
able
out.
to make the transition.
Yeah, they were. Now, some people say, how many monks were there? And the answer is probably, during the time of the monastery, about 40. What's interesting is they ranged from about 12 years of age, so they were very young, up to, I mean, life expectancy, late 40s in those days, that sort of age. So, I mean, people say, well, why would you want to become a monk? It was a very strict life. They lived according to rules, the Benedictines. They had a rule book, and they had to obey this rule book to the letter. So they laid down when they got up, what time they went to bed, what time they had the meals, what time they said the services, everything was laid out in the rules, very strict. They were silent, they couldn't speak to each other. I mean, obviously, if they were being given instructions or whatever, they'd speak, but in the general run-of-the-mill of the day, they couldn't have the sort of conversation I'm sort of having now. Why would you want to become a monk? On the other hand, life out there was very tough. You know, there was huge poverty, there was a lot of violence. At least they had safety, stability and security. And in some ways it was quite comfortable.
Some old-fashioned employees were a bit like that, you know, work no talk.
I mean, they got food and clothing and warmth and, you know, they weren't averse to a bit of gin and wine and, you know, and a few of the pleasures of life, as it were. So
they made good
there was a
wine.
positive side to being a monk. Anyway, if you'd like to come with me, you joining us, Joe, you coming with us?
Yeah. Oh, out of the way, probably.
You might as well learn about things. Come along. Now, this, people say, what are these contraptions? Does anyone know what this is? It's a heater. This is one of the earliest forms of public heating. It's made by a Victorian firm called Gurney & Co. And you will see they are dotted around the cathedral in various places. The one that's over on that side at the far end, which we'll pass towards the end of the tour, you'll see it has piping into the wall. That takes out all the gases. That took out all the gases. So this would originally have had the same. Coke powered, Coke in. Can you see these vents? And the idea is it's like convection, so they're all dotted around. And I'm told, because these were in operation until the 1990s, so relatively recent, the 1990s. If you stood close, pretty hot. But stand over here and you wouldn't feel a thing because all the heat was going on. But, yeah, so Victorian, one of the first forms of Victorian public heating for girls. And I gather in Gloucester Cathedral they're still being used. So, yeah. Anyway, if you'd like to follow me. Follow me. You're going to join us, Joe? Or?
Just a part of it.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, cool. You've got a few minutes. Yeah.
I might do it after hours.
I mean, for your point, it's quite nice just to learn something.
This one should be another
Sorry, just concentrate on that.
Try to piece it together into a group.
I'm guessing they didn't pump out the heat like electric fan heaters do.
No, not in those days. But in the 1990s, they installed underfloor heating. So we have underfloor heating now.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
then, yeah.
In 1990s. Now, the reason I come here first is that this is probably the oldest part. Okay? Now, can you see over here? That's about 1100. And that is typically what we call the Norman or Romanesque style. You see the arch? You see the arch? Now, originally, when they first built the monastery and the church, on that sort of balcony there, that's where the ceiling is. So quite low, and quite heavy. And if you have a look around here, those were the original windows. And look just how small they are. So there wouldn't be a lot of light, would there?
Right.
There wouldn't be a lot of light. Now, when they decided to change to the Gothic style, look on the right. So you get the contrast immediately. This is the Gothic and that's the Norman. And you can see how it's higher and higher. The ceiling was, the roof was raised. This roof is the oldest roof in the building. It's 1520. And I think what attracted the monks was because it was higher and much more light. There is a strong theological reason. Light of the world, Jesus Christ, light of the world, more light in, more God in. Do you follow? So that was the idea. So there was more, it was not just an architectural whim, there was a theological reason for it, having much more light. I mean, if you're going to go across Europe, and I'm thinking of Chartres, I'm thinking of Notre Dame, these are classically Gothic cathedrals. You know, these big arches, high arches. Now you might find this little thing quite interesting. This is obviously a painting of Madonna and Child. But what is fascinating about it, painted on cobweb. It's called the cobweb picture. And there are only 64 in the world. It's about 200 years old. And it comes from Innsbruck in Austria. We don't know how the cathedral got it. It was given to the cathedral. But it's obviously very valuable. And it is quite unique in the sense that there are only a small number, relatively, in the world, the cobweb picture. Now, people say, how on earth something like that on cobweb? You know, at home, you're going to touch cobweb and disintegrates. The answer is, it's done on caterpillar cobweb. So not spider's cobweb, caterpillar cobweb. And so it must be, the cobweb must be woven into silk and then painted on the silk. It's incredible, isn't it? Can you imagine? Yeah. Now this guy here, we think of him as a bit of an elephant in the room. Have a good look at the cobweb picture. This guy here is called John Pearson. He's buried here. This is his both memorial and where he's buried. He was Bishop of Chester in or around 1680. And he was famous for two reasons. First of all, he produced a very important book called An Exposition of the Creed, which is still regarded as an important work. But secondly, he was, to use a modern expression, he was an editor of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, the main prayer book. So that's why he's an important figure, John. Originally, he was buried by the main altar. But when the renovations were done in the Victorian period, George Gilbert Scott had the body moved here, and a bishop in America, Bishop Whittington in Maryland, in America, USA, he paid for all this. So he was still so well thought of 200 years after his death that an American bishop was willing to pay for that. I mean, that would be quite expensive even by standards of that day. Now that's cross, that little cross there, can you see, which you'll see in a minute, is beautifully carved. That's a narwhal, that's it, which is an Arctic kind of whale, is it? Yeah, narwhal, tusk, that's right, the tusk. That's a processional cross.
Oh, I see it, yeah.
Yeah.
I've never noticed that before.
No. Yeah, no. Again, it's quite rare, and it's a couple of hundred years old. So it's beautiful.
It's quite camouflaged into the brickwork.
Yeah, you don't notice it. No, that's
Yeah.
right. Right, can we? Now, this is the monastery. That's the church, and this is the monastery.
Right.
This is where the monks lived and worked. Slept, lived, worked and ate. And the monastery, like all monasteries, particularly Benedictine monasteries, is set around 4 passages, and they're called cloisters, the cloisters. And this section is or was the scriptorium, which is where the monks did their studying, their writings, their readings and so on. And this is a typical example of the kind of things the monks had. They had a small desk and a chair, seat to sit on, and of course it was all ink and quill. In those days there were no computers or anything like that. What I find remarkable is that when the monastery was built until 1520, so through 12, 13, 1400s, there was no glass and there was no roof. So there were the walls and the pillars, but it was all open. And as people have said, well, how did you study and write and work and stuff during the winter when it's raining or I don't know. But it was. Now the glass, we think plain glass went in when they put the roof on, and that was in 1520. This particular roof is, this one is more modern. It was restored in 1910. But the roof basically went on in 1520. When this section it was rebuilt, but a lot of this is normal. A lot of this is the original. So this is a scriptorium. Now the glass, that dates from 1924 to 32, and was done by a local firm called Even and Nicholson. And you can see John Pearson there. Can you see the bishop we've just been looking at? So, if you'd like to come with me, we'll show you the garden.
I've noticed one of King Charles there as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It depicts the sort of all the English characters. I mean, saints, if you like, but there are no Church of England saints. There's no such thing. I'll try and shout. But this area of the cathedral is called the Garth, and this was very important to the monks. It was where they exercised, but it was where they grew their vegetables and their herbs. They were entirely self-sufficient, and so they grew all their own vegetables and their herbs. Now their herbs were vitally important for medicine. It was their medicine. People from the community would come in for medicine grown here. The herbs were also important to things like their gin. And I don't know whether you've noticed in the shop here, but they sell Chester Cathedral gin. And it's made from herbs from this garden, interestingly enough. So, yeah, still made from herbs from
Buck
this garden.
Fussley are good
Yeah,
at
that's
making
right, yeah.
wine, and
I dare
here
say
it's
they've had
gin.
wines and things and stuff. Now, these gardens were laid out in their present form in the 1920s. But this water, this has been here since 1282. Remarkable. It was given to the cathedral in 1282, and it comes from 3 miles away. And as somebody said this morning, how on earth do you get water 3 miles away? It comes from a place that's known as Abbott's Well. Abbott's Well, obviously, this is the well of the water. And it was very important to the monks because they had all their fish in here. They were carp, that was their favourite diet, carp, but they had other fish as well. So the water's been coming here for 800 years or so. The statue in the middle, this was put in 94. It's by a guy called Stephen Broadbent, and it depicts Jesus and the lady from Samaria. Those of you know St John's Gospel, chapter 4, Jesus and the lady from Samaria. Now, why I like to bring people into the Garth is it gives you an idea of how the monastery worked, because each part had a function. So this is the refectory. Have you been in the refectory? That's where you get cups of tea and stuff. Have you not been in there? Not yet. Right, well you must go in. I'll try and take you in at the end of the tour.
I had a nice sandwich in there
You've had
earlier.
a sandwich.
Yeah.
Did you see the wall pulpit at the end? At the
Yes.
side? You saw the wall pulpit. That's the refectory. So that's where the monks ate. And that dates from 1290. This is where you came into. And that's called the undercroft. And that's where the monks stored everything. So they stored all their food, their drinks, stuff. It was cool. That was the cool stuff. This was the business end. This is where the monks did their business. We'll go and have a look at that in a minute. And above were their dormitories. Now, above now is what's called the choir school. And that was built in 2004. So that's a modern building. But originally, before that was there, it was with the dormitories where the monks slept. So that's where they slept. And here, this is the scriptorium where we've just been in. That's where they did their studies, their writing and so on. And of course behind, you've got the cathedral of the church. So you can see how the monastery functioned, how it worked. And Chester's very, very blessed to have, I think it's one of the few places in the country that still has remaining almost complete monastic buildings which are still being used on a day-by-day basis. So it's pretty tremendous really. Okay, so that's our chapel, it will be, yes, yeah. So just come through here. Now, we just have a look at this stone before we go into the chapter house. I just want you to look at the stones. I'm going to tell you a story about that. Can you see the wolf's head there? That's a wolf's head. But, well, I'll tell you a story about that when we go into the chapter house. So sorry, I haven't shown you. Just have a look at this stone. No, don't worry. Have a look at the stone. You see the wolf's head in the middle there?
Oh, yeah.
I'll tell you a story about that in a minute.
Okay.
Just follow me. As we're passing, where's Jack? You see the little mouse?
Oh yes.
Every church has a mouse, church mouse.
Was a notice board made by the guy from Yorkshire?
Yeah, Robert Thompson,
Yeah.
who uses church mouse. Yes, this ceiling is original, 1520. Yeah. Right, follow me now. Right, so I'll tell you what, we'll go in the chapter house.
Interesting, this place.
Yeah,
Get a bit of
absolutely.
drum acting in it as well.
Yeah, well, I know, yeah. Now, this was the business end of the monastery. As I said to you when we were in the garden, this side of the monastery was where the business was conducted. And this room here, which is called a vestibule, was basically a waiting room. What you've got to remember is the monastery was a big business. They owned a lot of land, and tenants and so on. And so the abbot and the senior monks were doing business every day, and tenants and so on, and traders and so on. And people would come here, they'd wait in the vestibule, and then they'd come into this room to do business with the abbot and the senior monks. Now, that part there is the first part that was done in the Gothic style. So that's about 1200. And then when they completed that, they built this. And this is about 1220, 1230. And this is typically what's described as early English Gothic. And can you see the very tall, thin, they're called lancet windows. Lancet after the word lance. Very similar shape with a point at the top. Now, I said earlier, the Benedictine monks were governed by rules. Everything was laid down, how they ran their day. And they had a rule book. And every morning, the monks met here at 8 o'clock. And when they met here every day at 8 o'clock, one of them was given the job of reading a chapter of the rules. And because they read a chapter of the rules every day, that's why this is called the chapter house. And that's where it gets its name. Now, the story I was going to tell you in relation to the stone I pointed out to you concerns what was once found around here, this doorway. In the 18th century, they decided, the cathedral decided, they'd make this room into a library. And so, to make it into a library, they needed to put in a new floor, because the floor was in a pretty bad state. And so they dug up the floor, and when they dug up the floor, they found that stone. And under the stone was a stone coffin. And when they opened the stone coffin, they found a skeleton dressed in black leather. Now, question, who is that? The slab has the wolf's head on it, Hugh Lupus. Now we know, it's fact, that in the last 3 months of his life, he came into the monastery as a monk. He died in 1101 and he came in for the last 3 months. And he was buried here, but nobody knows or knew where he was buried. But when they dug up this stone and also found this coffin, it raised the question, this could be Hugh Lupus. Now there was no way of knowing because, 1800s, they didn't have, DNA or anything, and anyway, there were no relatives living still. So it was impossible. And that really was the end of the story, until a couple of months ago, when they were doing this new floor. This is a new floor that they've just been renovated. And again, they dug, and below me, there, they discovered a skeleton. Now they've taken the skeleton away, I think. The question is, I asked somebody who was here at the time, it was very exciting, because this could be could you carbon date it? Could you carbon date it? Because if they could carbon date it to 1100, that would be really good evidence. Apparently she said, no, we can't carbon date things unless they're thousands of years old. They have to be very old. You'd think 1,000 would be long enough.
I never knew that. Yeah.
But so, anyway, they've taken it. I dare say they'll be doing all sorts of tests and stuff. But it is quite fascinating that 2 months ago, we've been telling the story for, a long time, but then it sort of ended when they discovered the coffin, but to think that a few months ago, they dug exactly the same area and they found bones, they found a body. So it's fascinating.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, I think he certainly was married. Well, of course, he became a monk at the end, so his wife would have been dead. I know he had lots of illegitimate children, because as I said to you, he was a very immoral man. He had lots of illegitimate children. But yes, I'm certain he was married, but I'm sure his wife was.
Bit of a James Bond.
But yeah, because monks couldn't be married. No. Anyway, follow me. This just depicts the modern tapestry. That just depicts the Chester Mystery Plays, which is due to come up at the end of next month. They're held every 5 or 10 years. This is obviously Nativity. What's interesting about it's modern, about 20, 30 years old. John Evans of Helsby did this. It's made out of disused water systems, so old toilets basically. Copper cylinders, old toilets made this.
Wow.
So, hello, how are you? Good. Do have a seat, because I'm sure you'll value the opportunity of a bit of a break. Now this is the Lady Chapel, and this, the monks every day, as part of their services, would say Lady Mass, which was a Mass to the Virgin Mary. And this is where Lady Mass would be held. And this is the first part of the church that was rebuilt in the Gothic style. So this dates from about 1260. So all of this is 1260. And it's again very typically early English Gothic. You see the tall lancet windows. The glass is Victorian. So that window is 1859, and this is glass here and there 1871. All done by the same manufacturer, a guy called William Wales from Newcastle. This glass and that glass was put in by the then Dean, called Howson, and this tells the story of St. Paul and that's St. Peter. And the reason is, of course, that in those days children, lots of adults, couldn't read and write. And the Dean was very keen to educate the children. And the best way of telling them about the Bible and St. Paul and St. Peter would be to have pictures. And so he used to bring the children in to show them the different pictures of St. Peter. Now, the colouring here is typically medieval. Although this was all done in the 1960s, it actually replicates very faithfully what medieval churches looked like. And in fact, this, through there, was all white. The walls were white in the medieval times and were cleaned by George Gilbert Stott in 1870. But this, the colouring, and these colours of green and gold and red, are very typically medieval colouring. So the idea that medieval period was austere and dark is wrong, actually. It was quite, churches were very colourful, quite ornate. The bosses, these are bosses, do you see them on the ceiling? These round, these are like junction boxes where the ribs come together. Well, they're called bosses, B-O-S-S-E-S. Perhaps the most interesting is that one. That's the one you want to photograph, that one there. That one depicts the murder of Thomas à Becket. Do you know who Thomas à Becket is?
Yes.
Thomas à Becket, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, murdered by the King Henry II in 1170. Now, after his death, his body, his resting place, became a shrine in Canterbury Cathedral. And around the country, various churches have memorials to him. Now, more to the Reformation, Henry VIII, he not only did away with all the monasteries and had all the medieval glass smashed, he also did away with all the shrines. And he also insisted that any memorial to Thomas à Becket had destroyed. And that, I think, is the only surviving memorial in the country to the murder of Thomas à Becket. That was put there in 1280. I think because A, it's quite high, and secondly, it's not prominent. You know, it's not in the main part of the church or anything. It's a bit out of the way. They just didn't see it. Yeah. Now, in this Lady Chapel, probably the most important thing is that. Does anyone know what that is? Somebody says, is it a pulpit? Is it a font? Is it a sort of mock of the tower that was going to be? And the answer is, that is a shrine. And that is the shrine to St. Werburgh. Have you heard of St. Werburgh?
Well, it was on something about saving a duck.
Goose.
Goose.
St. Werburgh.
Yes, so, but that's a mystery to me.
Well, I'll tell you about that. St. Werburgh. She is, amongst other things, the patron saint of Chester.
Oh.
And in fact, outside you've got Werburgh or St. Werburgh Street. And she's been the patron saint of Chester since about 1000, so a very, very long time. But she was a Mercian princess. Do have a seat, because we'll, take the weight off. She was a Mercian princess. Now, Mercia was the part of the country we now think of as the Midlands. So Birmingham, Stoke, even over to Norfolk, in the Midlands, the area of the Midlands. And her dad was king of Mercia, and her brother became king of Mercia. And she was born in 660 AD. And when she was 15, so 675, when she was 15, her father gave her a choice. And he said, you can either marry one of my noblemen, or if you refuse to marry him, you will have to go into a monastery as a nun. Now, I'm sure he thought she'd choose marriage, but in fact she chose the monastery. Perhaps she knew who he had in mind for her to marry, I don't know. And so she went into the abbey at Ely. And very quickly she was identified as a star. And she rose very quickly to become abbess of Ely. And thereafter she herself founded a number of monasteries in the area. And she was famous for her piety and devotion, but also she seemed to have great healing powers. People who came to her suddenly discovered that the pains they'd been experiencing in their back had vanished, or whatever it was. She seemed to have great healing powers, and she acquired this kind of almost legend, reputation. This is a woman who can heal you, she's incredible. And there is the story of the goose, and the legend of the goose is that somebody killed a goose, and the other goose, or geese, went to her and protested, and she brought the goose back to life. I mean, it's just a legend. But interestingly, I think her signature or her symbol are 6 geese, 6 goose, or anyway. But she died in 707, and when she died, she was buried at a place called Hambury. Now, Hambury is what we think of today as Stoke-on-Trent, so North Midlands. She was buried at Hambury, and very quickly, like Thomas à Becket, her resting place became a shrine. Because of this reputation for powers of healing, people used to visit her shrine looking for healing, and also for forgiveness and so on. And it became a big thing. However, by 900, the Vikings came from North Europe. They were threatening that part of the country. And so there was great concern that if the Vikings took hold of that part of the country, they might take her back to wherever they'd come from. And so they decided they'd move her to a safer place. Now, Chester, with its walls, has always been a fortified city, and they thought Chester was pretty safe. So she was brought here in 907. And it's why we know there was here a stone Anglo-Saxon church, because here it was to here she was brought. Originally, she was probably further down there, but then she was moved up here in 1340. So this was built, this particular shrine was built in 1340. Now, it's not complete. The bottom section and the very top, but you see the middle section is different, slightly more modern, slightly a different coloured brick. And the reason for that is, go back to Henry VIII, Reformation, he ordered all shrines to be smashed up, that had to be smashed up. Her remains had to be dug up and thrown away. This happened to Thomas Becket, and even today they've no idea in Canterbury where he is or what happened to his shrine, which is terribly sad. But here, the local people, first of all, they thought, we're not going to let this king rule roost over us. So although they had to dismantle the shrine, they made sure they knew where bits were left, what they did with the bits, and also it is said they reburied some further down. Okay, and interestingly, I think 30 years ago, Manchester University came here, and they had one of these instruments you can see underneath, and they discovered further down there is a hole. There was nothing in it. There again, you know, she died her body would just be
a skeleton.
Dust now, you know, thousands and odd years. But there is evidence that something might have been buried there a long, long time ago. But anyway, George Gilbert Scott, when he did his restoration in 1870, he decided to put that back together again.
I'm guessing
and
when
so the
they...
middle section is Victorian, but the very top section and the bottom section is original, so 1340. So this is an original shrine. People used to come and they'd kneel, put their head in, or they'd sit in there and pray. If you do that, I don't know whether this gentleman wants to take the chance, if you put your head in there and speak, you do get an echo. It's quite interesting. You do get a bit of an echo. Just put your head in and speak.
Hello?
And the idea is, if you're praying to God, it's almost as if God's speaking to you. So it's quite interesting, isn't it?
Looking at it, I can see, I'm guessing when they took it apart, they very carefully dismantled it brick by brick and installed them somewhere.
Very carefully, they did. I mean, unfortunately, they didn't keep it all, but they couldn't. I mean, there was only so much they could do with a ruthless character like with Henry VIII, you know.
Yeah.
And if you see the heads, you see the saints around, their heads have gone. But if you look at the side, there are heads on the side ones. So they haven't smashed them all. Now, the little thing I like to point out to people is this guy here. Now, that is a flea-ridden dog scratching his ear. Quirky, really, isn't it, for a shrine? Why would you have a flea-ridden dog scratching his ear? The answer is, if a flea-ridden dog is acceptable to God, then even the worst of sinners can get forgiveness. So that was the thinking behind when they built this.
A flea in the ear.
A flea in the ear in 1340. This little statue of St. Werburgh, that's modern, obviously. But, I mean, people have said, now where are the remains? We think, as I say, the hole was just about down there. So, yeah. So, the shrine of St. Werburgh. And the abbey was dedicated to St. Werburgh. It was St. Werburgh's abbey. It was St. Werburgh and St. Offal, but it was known as St. Werburgh's abbey. When it became a cathedral and abbeys were all dissolved, then it had to be called something different. But it was originally St. Werburgh's Abbey. Yeah. And you'll see on the glass, there are, and I'll point one or two out to you, there are images of St. Werburgh.
Sorry to interrupt you too.
That's all right.
I've just finished 2 cents away.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Pilgrimage route.
Oh, yes, from Lichfield. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, there is. Lichfield. And
Very
Lichfield.
timely.
Lichfield was the original diocese, because it was all part of the diocese of Lichfield.
I like that ceiling up there
Yeah, it's been fantastic.
in the next door.
Yeah, it's stunning, isn't it?
So, if you like to follow me, where's everybody here?
I thought there was a... Watch it. It says watch it.
Now, this is what I think most people would think of as the main bit of the cathedral. This is what we call the choir, Q-U-I-R-E, spelled Q-U-I-R-E. High altar, obviously. Mosaic at the back is by an Italian called Salviati. It's identical to the mosaic behind the high altar in Westminster Abbey, because he did that as well. What's interesting, can you see Judas Iscariot at the front there looking away from Christ, whereas all the other apostles are looking towards Christ, and they've all got halos, but he doesn't. So, yeah. And again, there is also, if you look here, there, a little mouse. That's the other little mouse, there. An American said to me a few weeks ago, "Where's the third mouse?" I said, "Well, I know where two are." One's on the notice board, and one's there. But he thought there were three, yeah. Huh? Yeah. Now, does anyone know what that is?
Is like an old? No, I thought it was some organ at first, but no.
No. Now that is why this is a cathedral, right? Because that is the bishop's throne. And bishop's throne in Latin is cathedra, and that's where the word cathedral comes from. You can't have a cathedral without a bishop's throne. Okay, so that's very important. That was made in 1875, and again, it's George Gilbert Scott. But if you stand here and just have a look at that, and then have a look at that, do you think that's all very much contemporary? Whoops. Do you think that's all very much contemporary, about the same sort of period? Do you think it all looks very much the same? Yeah.
Similar.
Well, that's 1870, and that's 1380. So there's 500 years difference. And this is some of the finest English carving in the country. This was done by the royal carpenters. And there were three of them, William and Hugh Hurley and William Newell. And they did this in 1380. And this carving, if you look at each one of these are called tabernacles, which is an old word for tent. These little sort of arches, they're called tabernacles. And each one is different. And they celebrate creation. So they're celebrating creation, but every one is different. And they're done in English oak, but the wood underneath, which is entirely plain and intended to be plain to emphasize their beauty, is Baltic oak. So different. What I find astonishing is that up to 1870, these were painted green. Painted green. And George Gilbert Scott had all the paint taken off. That's why I've had a lady say to me on the tour, "Could do with the dust." Yeah. There's a slight fadiness about them or hue about them. But there isn't. They've been very properly dusted and clean. It's the paint. It was the process of taking the paint off that left that.
I wonder why you decided that the paint on needed to go on.
Oh, yeah.
Because you think it could cause damage, too.
Well, I know. Great thing to do, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Considering they were even in 1870, 500 years old. Now this is where the monks came for their services every day. And if you just look here, this is where they'd be. Each one had a stall. And they had to stand throughout the services. And there were about 6 a day, and each one lasted about an hour. You can imagine if you were getting elderly, it was a bit of a struggle. So they came up with this idea, a little perch, so they could perch. And this is called a misericordia.
Oh, is that a missing?
A misericord, yeah, misericord. From the Latin misericordia, which means to take pity. Now, when the carvers did all this, they took it as an opportunity to do these lovely carvings under each one.
Is that a hyenas or something?
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I mean,
And a horse.
The one I like is called the crafty fox. Now, they've got, some have religious significance and some are entirely secular. For example, there's one of a woman beating her husband.
Oh.
Yeah, one of her husband, chastising her husband, and really laying into him. But the one I like is the crafty fox, and that shows a fox lying down playing dead. and the fox is being pecked by birds, and of course he's just waiting to pound someone for his lunch. And the idea is that sin pecks at you gradually, but if you're not careful, it can grab you completely and overawe you see. So
I
the,
found that
a kind of sort of religious
a cat, I remember, got a pigeon later in the afternoon. My neighbour had to rescue the cat
Right.
because all the other birds, the magpies
Oh,
and
right,
everything,
yeah, yeah.
swamped down and they were
Doing
pecking the
it,
cat.
yeah.
Saying, you killed my mate.
Now this little fella's called the Drunken Pilgrim.
Oh, yes, I was wondering.
Now this actually that's a bit of that's Victorian, and the reason we know that is because the face is the dean of the time. He was dean, and he was the head verger. This character underneath, and it said they hated each other, and so as a joke, the carpenters, when they were doing the renovations in 1870 or thereabouts, put that in, portraying the dean as a drunkard. You know, a drunkard. It's called the Drunken Pilgrim, and underneath. Somebody at his sort of feet. But this little fellow, this is 1380. That is 1380. Does
That's
anyone know
nice.
what that is?
An elephant?
An elephant, yeah. Well, that's called Elephant and Castle.
Ah,
It's said to be an elephant with a castle on its back. And that comes... What happened was that the Crusades, do you know what the Crusades were? When soldiers from this country went over to Jerusalem to try to free Jerusalem from the Muslims, basically, in about 1360. When they came back from the Crusades, they were talking about these big animals, like elephants, big, huge animals, which had soldiers on their backs and so on. Well, stories increased with the telling, and soon the soldiers became castles on the elephants' backs. Hence, elephant and castle. Now, the carpenters had never seen an elephant. They could only go by description. Hence, the rather strange trunk and the horse's hooves.
Right. Looks like a horse with
Horse's
a
hooves.
head.
Yeah, 1380. But he up there, the stone there, you see the stone feature? That's Edward I.
Oh, is it?
And underneath, on the other side, underneath, you see the angels, and then underneath the angels, a woman. You got that? That's Eleanor, his wife. And they came here in 1290, when this was being built, and they had Holy Communion here, on this spot where we are now. And we don't know whether they went in before they came to curry favour with them, or after their visit as a mark of them. And these two here, on the back of this seat, those two guys, those are two of the royal carpenters who did this woodwork. They are the Hurlands, Hugh and William Hurland. So they've obviously done themselves for posterity. Now this part of the cathedral, this was done in about 1270 and 1310. So it took 30 or 40 years to do this part. And one of the reasons, they had 6 different stonemasons over that period. Now stonemasons were like the managers, the bosses. They had lots of stonemasons master masons. They had 6 different master masons. They had lots of stonemasons under them, but they had 6 different master masons. We know that from the different styles of architecture that there are. And really the reason why it took so long was that Edward I was battling the Welsh, and he was building Welsh castles, and he needed every stonemason he could get. So on 2 occasions it is recorded that the cathedral, and the word used is loaned, I think he pinched that, had to give him 100 stonemasons on 2 occasions. So that's why there was a bit of delay. Yeah. But the cathedral got its own back because eventually, in about 1290, 1300, Richard the engineer, who built Carnarvon Castle, very, very famous master stonemason, master mason, Richard the engineer, he came here. The king sent him here to finish it all off. So the cathedral was fortunate to get Richard the engineer at the end. Yeah. If you look at these two little guys up there, again, for posterity, can you see that? He's the chief engineer holding up the building, and he's the master mason looking at the plans.
So if I can get a zoom in.
yeah. So if you follow me, this is probably the funniest window we've got in the world. This is by a guy called Augustin Puget, very famous designer, architect, artist, etc. This was done in 1850. Augustin Puget, Big Ben, the Elizabethan Tower, he did that. He did the Houses of Commons. Very famous, Augustin Puget, and he did that window. So it's probably the best window we've got.
It's very colourful.
Very colourful, yeah. This chapel is Victorian. This was dedicated to a Victorian engineer called Thomas Brassey, who built about a third of the Victorian railways in England, and was a local man, went to school locally, and is commemorated by that chapel. But it is Victorian. It looks medieval, doesn't it? The colouring, the style of it, you think it was medieval, but it's not. It shows how clever they were.
It's a shame we don't have skilled craftsmen and women like this in the country now.
Well,
Yeah.
this is it now. We'll have even less in the future with AI, I think. You know, it'll all be done by computers, won't it, now?
Yeah,
Anyway, if you'd like to follow me.
I don't
Can
like
you see-
computers.
This is the vent that you see the heater vent. That's how all it works. Now I'm going to ask a question. Do you know how many organ pipes there are? Do you want to guess?
1,000?
Anyone? Any other ideas?
120.
There are 4,894.
Holy smokes.
Wow.
4,894.
Are they all functional?
All functional, every one of them. And if you were here on Sunday, as I was, it's a tremendous sound. Oh, it is. Yeah. All functional. The organ, again, built by George Gilbert Scott. Well, it was actually constructed by a local firm called Charles Whiteley and Co. But it was designed by George Gilbert Scott. He designed the screen. His grandson, Giles Gilbert Scott, did the figures. Giles built Liverpool Cathedral. So, very famous architect as well. This memorial here, that's to Thomas Green. It shows Thomas Green, his two wives. I'm hasten to add, not at the same time. He was Mayor and High Sheriff of Chester, died in 1602. What's interesting about it, can you see his hands and their hands, praying hands, cut off? That was after the English Civil War when they did that. They wanted to take their heads off because it'd been very popular. They pleaded with them not to, and they agreed not to. So at least we've kept the face, the heads. We know what they look like.
How old is the organ?
The organ is about 1870. Yeah, again, made by Charles White. But yes, 4,800 pipes. I think there are 7 points. Whether that means there are 7 places where the organ can be connected up, I don't know. But yeah, there are a lot. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it's fantastic. Okay, right forward. This is what's called the south transept. I mean, cathedrals are always built inside of the cross. What's unusual about Chester is this was completed in 1340. The north transept, of course, was 1100. So this was later. They needed to add 4 chapels. Now, normally, they'd have 2 on each side, and it would be the same. But they couldn't build out that way because that's where the monastery is. That's where the cloisters are. So they were blocked off. So they can only build out this way. So this is actually the largest transept in any cathedral in England. That's unusual. But it is unusual to have it much bigger than the other one.
What's the history on those brass eagles I've seen around?
I don't know. You know what the eagle is, why it's an eagle? Because that's the highest flying bird.
Ah, right.
And it's often St. John, it's the sign of St. John St. John who wrote the Gospel, and the idea is the bird, of course, flies to heaven. You see, highest flying bird.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's why we have a new. But
Bird of prey.
now, about 25 years ago, that window, which again is Victorian, Eden, Butler and Burn, it's called the Triumph of Faith. And about 25 years ago, they had to replace all the lead in it. So they had to take every pane out and then replace it. Not put it back. You can imagine how difficult that would be. And they made one mistake. They got one pane upside down, and they had to then put it back. Yeah. But it was a big job, taking every single pane out, and then cleaning it, redoing the lead, and then putting it back. Yeah. Okay, that's all. Monks, it was monks. Oh, the nuns were literate, yes. All of them were very literate. It was one of the advantages. They got a proper education. Because it was passed down, you see, from generation to generation. So they'd come in as a 12 or 13-year-old, quite young, and the older ones would teach the younger ones how to read and write. Because they were, the Benedictines in particular, were great, because they didn't have printing, they were great copyists. They copied things, so they had to learn to read and write. It was very important. Yeah. This is the only surviving ecclesiastical court in the country. So in here, they will try heresy, witchcraft, defamation. The judge would sit up there. The witness would be giving evidence from there. The stenographer, the person who kept the record of the proceedings, would sit up there. The lawyers would be sitting around here. Now, the reason there's a table, and the reason there is this rather unusual contraption, a chair, well, it's not a chair, but it's a seat into that, is a lot of the things that the court had to deal with were civil disputes, and that might involve land, property. And so they had a table for maps. They didn't have computers, for maps. And what would happen is the court clerk, he was called the applicant.
Oh, that's a seat.
He sat there, and he'd have a long pole. And if a witness said, well, it was field A or field B, he could then point on the map where it was, so they all knew. So there was a purpose to it. But yeah, it's very unusual and very well preserved. This was actually set up in 1636. So this goes back to 1636. Yeah.
Where does the defendant sit?
Well, that's a good question. Do you know, I don't know the answer.
Because I can see a bit there now
Yeah,
where
you
they
can
might
see where
give
that-
evidence.
And maybe he sat here, maybe he sat here.
Possibly, yes.
I mean, these days you'd think, where's the dock, you know?
The magistrate can glare straight at the
but
defendant
perhaps
if
it's here.
he's sat here.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the public presumably sat there and around the wall. But of course, one thing they would try here, and they probably tried here until about, I was going to say, 80 years ago, would be errant priests who'd, done naughty things. They'd be tried here. Yeah. So I bet this can tell some stories, this room. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Executions, possibly.
Well, there were. I mean, George Marsh was tried here. George Marsh, in 1555, was tried in this building for heresy, and he was then burnt at the stake. So, it was serious business. It was. And his memorial is outside Chester, where he was executed. Yeah. Now, this window here, which you've obviously seen when you came into the building. I mean, it strikes you. This was put in 1961, so it's relatively modern. Quite controversial at the time, mainly because it was considered very modern. Though I think now it's very traditional, actually, when you look at it. Now there's St Werburgh on the left. Can you see? There's St Werburgh. And the others are, I mean, in the middle you've got the Holy Family. You've got Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus. You've got the Holy Family in the middle. And on this side you've got Aidan and Oswald, and you've got Chad, Wilfrid and Ethelred.
Really pictures.
And they're all northern saints, including St Werburgh, obviously. And the connection is Oswald and Aidan, Chad and Wilfrid, and their connection is to Lindisfarne in the northeast. But that was put in 61. Now, the reason they needed to put that in was that the Victorian window, which had been there, was blown out during the Second World War. And it was blown out because the Germans dropped a bomb, parachute bomb, which almost hit the building. The job it didn't, but a gunner by over across the road, Tunnel, shot it out of the sky just before it landed, but the shockwave blew out the glass, and all the glass on this side.
Wow.
So it was pretty. They then replaced it with plain glass, and then in 61 put that back on. Now, can you look to this window there, the second window back? Can you see there's a light shining on it? It's like a stone sculpture. Some people say, is it a dog? Is it a cat? Does anyone know what that is? Anyone, any ideas? That is actually the devil. And that's the devil in chains. And that's called the Chester Imp. 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 Chester Imp.
I've heard
And the
of
story,
that.
the legend
Where it
is
was.
that in the 14th century, a monk was walking along that gallery. Can you see where the lights are? You can actually walk along that gallery. And as he walked along, he saw, looking through that window, the devil. And he ran to the abbot and said, I've just seen the devil looking through the window. So the abbot said, right, get the stonemason, get him to do that. The devil in chains in a most, I mean, it's awfully uncomfortable. Devil up there, in chains, and in a terribly uncomfortable situation. And the idea is that if the devil ever comes back and looks through that window, he'll see what will happen to him if he tries to get into the cathedral. And the devil's never been seen since, so it obviously worked. Yeah, imagine that. Now I did say I'd just show you the refectory before we finish, so if you'd like to follow me. This is the refectory. This is where the monks ate every day. If you want to just come further in, let me just show you. Can you see on the right there? On the right here, you perhaps have to stand over here to have a better. That's called a wall pulpit. Very unusual. And what happened was that the monks, as I said to you earlier, were a silent order. They couldn't speak, apart from if they were having education or being given instructions and so on. And they had to eat in silence. But one of them read the scriptures whilst they ate, and will be from the wall pulpit. So that's 1290, the wall pulpit. It's very unusual.
I love the wood, the ceiling.
Well, the ceiling's false, believe it or not. The ceiling was put in 1939, and it's a false ceiling. It looks very old, doesn't it?
What is it made of wood or?
Yes, made of wood.
Yes.
It is wood, but it's not the proper ceiling.
I thought you were going to say it's made of plastic.
No,
then
no,
or something.
no. There's a ceiling above. I say ceiling. There's a roof above. It's not the proper roof, if you follow me.
So it's just cosmetic.
Like a floating ceiling.
Yeah, yeah. But it's great, isn't it? Isn't it very impressive? It looks like a camber beam ceiling or roof, and it's but above it is a proper structure.
I was thinking of a false ceiling at my place as noise reduction from a flat upstairs, but I wouldn't be able to do that kind of
No, no. No, you couldn't.
no, just
No.
a bit of plasterboard, some
No, quite.
insulation to block noise, and some paint.
This window here, modern obviously, that's called the creation window. That was put in 2001, and it tells the 6 days of creation. Okay, so you start at the left, and the top bit is supposed to be a representation of, I suppose, the situation. But the bottom window is a modern depiction. So the left-hand one is light. Okay, God created light. So that is said to show light. And the modern bit is it's actually a photograph taken of New York City on a camera that's got a pause, and the lights are car headlights and so on. So that just, now the second one gives you an easier example, because that's water. God created water, and that's underneath. The modern one is the Earth, picture of the Earth from the International Space Station. The end one at the end is an easy one for me, because that's man. That's the creation of man, and the bottom one, of course, is the baby in the womb. And just above the baby, do you see the DNA helix?
Oh, right.
So it's now. Do you see? If you look at it, do you see the hand of God in sort of the thumb? The thumb's coming down. Do you see the hand of God? And the white dove at the top. The white dove. I mean, there's more in that than you spend hours looking at that, working it out. Yeah, it was done by a lady called Rosalind Grimshaw in 2001. She had Parkinson's disease, sadly. And in fact, that's an image of her brain there, showing the Parkinson's disease. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that's the view, obviously, and this is the old, because this tapestry is 1620. And that shows St Paul and the Sorcerer at Limus, and it comes from Mortlake in London, and that used to hang behind the Hales. So, yeah.
What is this modern picture up here?
Well, that came last year, because last year they had a display of art depicting Christ to represent all the races. So we had Christ in black as a black man, Christ as Chinese, and so on. And so that's supposed to be Christ, I think, as a black and white man.
Modern day Christ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's the idea that we're all made in Christ's image. We're all made in
Yes.
God's image, and so whether you're black or white doesn't matter, because we're all the same. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. If you follow me. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming on this tour. It's been very
Thank
kind
you.
of you. I mean, the Cathedral does appreciate your support and your generosity, and thank you for doing it, because, you know, the cost of this place is pretty enormous. Oh, massive. I mean, the maintenance costs alone are something like £2 million a year, and they don't get any money from central government or the central church. It's all self-funded.
Not like
your
Buckingham
support
Palace.
is very much appreciated. So thank you very much indeed. So if I was you, I'd have a cup of coffee now. I think you deserve it. Or just have a wander around and maybe have a look at some of the things I've pointed out to you.
Okay, thank you.
But I hope you enjoy your visit. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.